with us some tips on gardening for wildlife. So please join me in welcoming Emma.
Thank you, Audrey. Is this thing on? I think it is. Well, I'm certainly pleased to be here tonight. I'm assuming we have some avid gardeners here? Oh yeah? Excellent. Love that. Like Audrey said, I have a background in horticulture. I thought my entire career when I got out of college was going to be in public horticulture, working at a botanical garden. So I have various experiences, starting at the Morris Arboretum in Philadelphia, and then slowly making my way back north, where I was at Heritage Museums and Gardens on Cape Cod for a few years, then at Tower Hill Botanic Garden, which is now New England Botanic Garden, before working for UNH Extension, and then finally finding my home here at the Science Center. If my name sounds familiar, that's because both of my parents worked for the Science Center for over 40 years apiece. So I spent a good bit of my childhood at the Science Center, and this has really been a homecoming for me. So
you're on NPR.
I'm on NPR. I used to be on WMUR, but now I'm on NPR. So NHPR, I should say. But now it's a really wonderful job. I get to manage Kirkwood Gardens, as well as the grounds in general around the Science Center. So we've got some exciting stuff coming up. I've got some projects to share with you tonight that we've done at the Science Center, where we're actually trying to improve habitat. And yeah, so this is a very casual environment. I invite you to, if you have any questions as we're going along, just interject. I'm happy to have this be conversational. This specific talk I've not given before. So you all are my guinea pig audience tonight. So hopefully you're up for that task. So tonight, gardening for wildlife. Who here, by a show of hands, is already doing that, do you think? In your homes? Most, right? Yeah. And so this is kind of an interesting topic, right? So a lot of the time when we say gardening for wildlife, we have specific wildlife in mind, right? And this is true for me.
Woodchucks, voles, bears.
Yeah. So no woodchucks, voles, bears, deer. On my own property, I planted a whole bunch of new trees and shrubs this past year, and the deer have gorged themselves on the buds of all of them. So we'll see what happens come spring. But yeah, I mean, it really, when we're thinking about gardening for wildlife, there's a lot of different species in New Hampshire, and we may have different goals for who we want in our yards, who we don't want in our yards. But we're going to talk just broadly about how to encourage diversity in a designed landscape. So wildlife gardening really is all about creating habitat. And habitat is the area within an ecosystem where an animal is able to secure the food, water, cover, and space it needs to survive and reproduce. So in our landscapes, if we're gardening for wildlife, we're basically trying to create habitat. We're looking at our property and trying to identify what's missing, if you will. Are we missing cover? Are there no places for animals to hide or build their nests? Is there no food? Perhaps we're lacking a water source? Perhaps all the above. We're doing what we can to basically try to make this as complete an area as possible for as many different species as possible. Habitat loss, you've probably heard this before, but habitat loss is the greatest contributing factor to wildlife population declines. And I should add in insects as well here, right? We've all been hearing a lot about how insect populations have really been taking a precipitous decline, which is really concerning overall. And really it comes down to habitat loss, which in our area of New Hampshire, really that's habitat fragmentation mainly, where we divide up wooded parcels or meadows, or even in some cases wet areas, into smaller and smaller pieces for business, for our homes. And there's kind of no getting around this to a certain extent, right? Like people need a place to live. But how a lot of people treat their own properties is unfortunately a lot like that picture you see over there on the right with the manicured yard, with the manicured shrubs, and most of those are not going to be native to this part of the world. And that does not mean that you don't see any wildlife in this property at all, just you're not seeing a tremendous diversity based on what we have for species there. Okay, so my little note there that conservation begins at home, and creating wildlife gardens is a good first step. Has anybody here read any of Doug Tallamy's books? I see a couple. Doug Tallamy is an entomologist in the University of Delaware who's written several books. So his focus is really from insects on up, but worth checking out if you find this stuff interesting. Note here that gardening for wildlife is both art and science. I'm coming from this really from the horticulture world, so I'm often very concerned about aesthetics. Or not often, I'm typically concerned with aesthetics, especially when we're talking about a landscape around your house. So certainly a landscape or a garden for wildlife can be beautiful. There are design elements we're going to talk about where this space can be both functional and aesthetic. It doesn't have to be. And it's up to you how wild you want this to be or how maintained you want this area to be. But there's science to it as well, because every single wildlife species out there that we might try to attract to our backyards has specific habitat needs. And this is just to note that there's really no one right way to do this to support wildlife in your property. You really have to consider that every single property is different. I think we know this, right? Just the size of our lots, also what the surrounding is. You know, we can't necessarily control what our neighbors are doing or what other sort of development is in the area. And then the local and regional wildlife populations are going to differ as well. So you might say, boy, I'd love to have Karner blue butterflies come to my garden. But if you don't have any pine barren habitat near you, not likely going to happen. And as I said before, each wildlife species really does have its own habitat needs, but fortunately there's a lot of crossover between. So the elements influencing wildlife use of our landscape, the things we can control. One is our plant layers, i.e. what do we have growing in our yards amongst various levels. The plant species diversity, how many different species do we have? If we're trying to increase the diversity of animal or wildlife species we have, the more plant species we have is really going to improve that. Any special habitat features or acquired habitats, and by that I mean there's some species that require, let's say, a pond, a water source to be right there, or maybe a snag tree, a dead tree that has all sorts of different cavities in it for wildlife to use. There's some of those things you need to have that if you want to have this critter. And then unique microhabitats. And by that I mean, you might need something like some fallen logs on your property to have certain species. And then of course, I kind of mentioned this, but things we can't change but we still need to consider, which is really, where is your property? If you're right in downtown Meredith, there's a lot of species that probably aren't going to come to your yard even if you build it. And then just the condition of the landscape around your property. So put this little bit together here. So who you get visiting your property really just comes down to habitat and access to your habitat. So if you have the pond in this illustration and the frog can get to it by any means, then you're probably going to have that frog at least sporadically or periodically on your property for that use. However, if for some reason you were completely walled in by roads, again I'm thinking like downtown Meredith where you've got street and development all around you, even if you build that little pond, the frog may or may not be able to get there. So we have a lot of wildlife species in New Hampshire, as you're probably aware. Over 275 species of birds, 40 plus reptiles and amphibians, 60 mammal species, and really countless insects. And a lot of these guys we're really not going to be able to support in our backyards, per se. There's a lot of species out there that really do need contiguous forests, so we're not going to be able to help there. But there is an awful lot that we can do. So this is where we start to get into thinking about how our landscape is designed or laid out. Wildlife really select their habitat based on the arrangement and density of plant layers and also soil types. So every single species we can think of out there is dependent on a certain type of plant or community of plants that we see in the landscape. And these are kind of our main categories here. We have down here, not mentioned, our mulch layer. That's our leaf litter that you'd find on the forest floor. Then we have from 0 to 2 feet or so our ground cover or herbaceous layer. Above that, from 2 to 10 feet or so is our shrub layer. And then from 10 to 30 feet, we would call our mid-story layer, which is a lot of our very tall shrubs or small understory trees. And then finally, our canopy layer, which is over 30 feet tall, and that's the mature, large trees that we have in our landscape. Okay, so starting with the mulch layer, which is that very bottommost layer of leaf litter. You've probably heard at this point a lot of people encouraging you to leave the leaves. That's spoken of a lot, and that's really important when it comes to encouraging wildlife on your property. That leaf litter layer is important for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it's maintaining soil moisture and temperature. Now, mulches that, say, a chip bark mulch or something in our yard is going to do, to a certain extent, the same thing for the soil, but it's not necessarily going to support the same diversity of invertebrates, those arthropods, those insects, and other critters that are going to be in that natural soil or natural forest duff layer. It also helps protect the soil from erosion. Find as soon as that leaf litter layer goes away, those raindrops that are pummeling the ground tend to erode that soil away really fast. So it always breaks my heart a little bit when I see that somebody's gone into the woods with their leaf blower to blow away a path or whatever else, because that is a lot of protection for the soil. And this is the layer that's associated with decomposition too. This is where our microbes are that are breaking down wood, breaking down this forest duff layer and making it into humus. And it's also where a lot of insects are living. So over here we have, it's not an insect, but arthropod there, that pill bug. A lot of insects or other arthropods or other invertebrates, I should say, that live in that forest duff layer, in that leaf litter layer, that are really important food for things like salamanders and for birds like that white-throated sparrow that pretty much primarily are feeding right at that ground layer. So leaving as much of that as you can as possible. And I should note here too, like in Kirkwood Gardens, if you've been there, you may note that like, oh, they don't leave all their leaves here. We kind of balance it a bit because this is more of a formal garden, right? So oftentimes in the backs of beds where there are plants that are sturdy enough to hold up to a heavy oak leaf layer, I will leave those leaves. But where we get closer to the front of the bed or where we have more delicate plants, we do end up shredding some of those leaves so that they're just a finer mulch. Now, you could probably make the argument that we're maybe damaging some critters that were in those leaves to begin with, but it's just this whole balance in gardening, right? With where we're trying to achieve this very polished, albeit productive garden for wildlife and pollinators there. But to a certain extent, when you're trying to grow prairie plants, let's say things that are not adapted to a thick forest leaf litter layer, they don't appreciate it when you leave 2 inches of oak leaves on top of them. So balance there. Okay, moving up, our ground cover and herbaceous layer. So important to have that mulch layer. This is the next layer. This is our 0 to 2 feet or so, and this is all of our perennials that are in the garden. And this would include a lawn too, if you have it. These herbaceous plants are protecting the soil underneath. And this is largely from events like rainfall. Now, rain is incredibly damaging, especially when it comes down in these really heavy torrents where it's pummeling the soil and washing a lot of it away. These protect the soil, protect the critters that are living below that. And it's also really critical habitat for a lot of insects, or I should say wildlife, but insects being probably the most important, particularly the pollinators. We don't have a ton of native trees in New Hampshire that are flowering, that are actually providing pollen and nectar for pollinating insects. A lot of what they're using is that understory layer, those wildflowers, those herbaceous plants. And it's naturally diverse. You know, in New Hampshire is not nearly as diverse, our woods, or really our landscape in general, as other parts of the country. But there's still always a tapestry of different species in any given area. You rarely see a monoculture of any sort. And so examples would be any of your ferns, these count. Foam flower in the middle, which is one of my favorite native wildflowers, and then any of our native grasses, really any perennial that we're thinking of. Okay, next up is our shrub layer, and this is going to be all of the flowering shrubs and vines that grow, typically this layer, I'm saying up to 10 to 12 feet or so is our shrub layer. And this is where we can integrate a lot of our fruit and nut producing species, things like hazelnuts, things like hollies. Somebody's getting their food, excellent. And it's also the backdrop for many garden designs. A lot of shrubs, a lot of times we're putting in the back of our borders. And these are really important foraging habitat and also, to a certain extent, nesting habitat for a lot of songbirds. So shrub layer, important. Mid-story layer, too. And mid-story layer for somebody who has a smaller yard or garden may be the highest layer that you have. This is our trees that are probably topping out at 20 to 30 feet. and typically species that are a little bit more shade tolerant, although they still love to be out in full sun. This again is also really important nesting and foraging. So species I have up here that are worth highlighting on the left is Cornus alternifolia, which is the alternate-leaved or pagoda dogwood. We are blessed with having a lot of this in the Holderness area, or just in the Lakes region in general. A lot of it at the Science Center. So, in a number of areas that we've cleared invasive species out, this is kind of one of the few natives that's still sticking around. But as a fruit that's enjoyed by small mammals and birds, and also just quite attractive. That middle picture there, I'm stretching what we're calling a New Hampshire native thing here, but that is a redbud, Cercis canadensis. If you know me, you know that I kind of like to extend the definition of what's native and do a little bit of assisted migration with plants. That means growing things that grow in a climate further south from us, so things that typically you'd only find in the southeast or even the mid-Atlantic, but with our changing climate are able to survive up here. You know, there is concern that a lot of plants aren't going to be able to move fast enough to keep up with climate change. So Cercis, redbud, is a really wonderful understory tree that you can find further south. And it is really nice for nectar. Not only it's beautiful, first off, which catches my eye, but it's a really good nectar plant. It's used by a lot of different bees, butterflies. I don't know if hummingbirds use it. Cool plant, and I wouldn't discourage you from planting it. We just put one in Kirkwood a couple of years ago that's doing pretty well. And then another one of my favorites over here, because I did spend some time in the mid-Atlantic, is pawpaw. Has anybody heard of pawpaws? Yeah, so this is a native, North American native fruiting tree that has never made it into the commercial industry because the fruit doesn't store very well. Once it's ripe, you've got days to eat it. So, and it bruises really, really easily. So it makes it maybe into local farmers market where you can find it in New Jersey or Pennsylvania or further into the Midwest. But it's not a plant that you can really, or a fruit that you can ship across the country readily. But it's really, really wonderful. There is an amazing stand at the Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens that was fruiting when I last visited there. So I've planted a couple of these on my own property to experiment with, but that's a lot of wildlife will eat that fruit too. And then we have our canopy layer, which is our large forest trees, which for most of us probably if we're planting any of these now, we're not really ever going to see the benefit of those trees. So if we have this layer on our property, it's because those trees are existing and they didn't get taken down when the house was built. But these are species that are used by a lot of songbirds, and this is where a lot of insects are hanging out too. So there's a lot of warblers that many of us never really see because they're always way up in that canopy layer, just feasting on the caterpillars they can find up there. But a lot of these species too are what we would consider mast-producing trees. So they're producing a lot of nuts and seeds, in some cases fruit, things that are feeding a lot of wildlife. Oaks, again, if you've read any of Doug Tallamy's stuff, you have read that oaks are really the most productive group of plants in the landscape that you can possibly have. They host an incredible number of insects, incredible diversity, tons of caterpillars. And some theories on why that is. One reason might be just because oaks have been around longer than a lot of the other trees in the landscape. And insects have had more time to adapt to the defense mechanisms that those oaks have, which really isn't a lot. It's just tannins that makes those fruits and those leaves very bitter. But tons of lepidopterans, those moths, that don't mind that whatsoever. So oak, if you have it, keep it. Those leaves are a pain in the butt if you're a gardener, I know. But really, really wonderful wildlife plant. The acorns are a pain too, but they're really kind of like top species. Cherries are excellent too. Really any of the cherries. Black cherry is the only species I would consider a canopy species in our area. Again, kind of messy. If you have horses, don't have this one because it's super toxic to them. But those fruits are eaten by a lot of critters. White pine, again, I don't know anybody here who's planting a white pine unless it's maybe some fancy little dwarf variety that's maybe not real productive. But those seeds from white pine are used quite heavily, and there's some moths too that rely on this exclusively. And then birches too. Birches are a little tough in a lot of landscape scenarios because they do struggle in hot, dry conditions where we don't have a lot of irrigation, number of disease issues, insect issues. Kind of the reason you don't see white birch in commerce a lot anymore, just because it was fraught, because there's too many things that like to eat it. But if you have a nice wild birch tree, it's a great thing to hold on to. And river birch to a certain extent, although it's an incredibly fast-growing tree, and I caution you about where you put that. If you want to know what that looks like, visit Kirkwood Gardens and go down to our pergola area and look at the big, huge trees that are down there with these big arching branches. Those have only been there since 1996. They're about this big around. They're at risk of splitting, breaking out at any time. But I think we're going to see who wins, the birch or the pergola.
Emma,
Yeah.
you didn't include beech. Is that because you just can't include everything?
I can't include
Or
everything.
do you
I-
discourage beech these days because they ain't gonna grow?
I wouldn't discourage beech. I mean, beech is important too. I think in a landscape setting, American beech can be more challenging because of the way that it suckers. If you have seen beech, it is capable, kind of like aspen, of forming these clonal colonies. So you have one, and then another pops up off of that root system. So it doesn't lend itself well to gardening per se, but if you have it in your woods, leave it be. Those beech nuts are really important food. Bears love them. You may not want the bears in your yard though. Ash trees, same thing. Probably a lot of you have ash trees that have died, or you've driven by areas where emerald ash borer has taken those out. There's some hope maybe for young ash trees with some parasitic wasps that have been introduced, that perhaps our young, small caliper or diameter ash trees might be able to make it, but a lot of those big mature trees are not going to be long for this world, unfortunately. And the only thing I'll say about ash from a landscape perspective is that it's a tree that when it dies quickly and it falls apart quickly. Now, an oak or a maple you can leave standing for a lot of years, and it takes a while for those limbs to shed and fall off, but ash, for whatever reason, I don't actually know what it is, but it falls apart really, really fast. That wood becomes very brittle and it becomes a hazard quickly. So in Kirkwood, where we have a number of ash trees that have had to come down because ash borers have killed them and they've become a hazard, we have removed enough that they're no longer a hazard, but we've left these tall stumps to still be habitat for woodpeckers. That is very controversial amongst visitors and amongst fellow staff members even, although it is catching a little bit. We have left taller stubs of our ash trees in a few other spots along the Science Center's exhibit trail, just to be these foraging snag trees, but without this arching canopy that's going to come down at any minute, and we don't know when. Hemlock too. All of our trees have issues. Oaks, we worry about oak wilt coming this direction. Everybody's got something. If they're healthy, keep them. Okay, so I just talked about all those layers. In general, landscapes that have multiple vegetation layers tend to support a greater number of species than those lacking one or more. So if you can have that mulch layer, that herbaceous layer, shrub layer, understory, canopy layer, if you can have all of those, generally you're going to have more species coming onto your property. That said, there are certain species that require habitats where one or more layers are lacking. So if you've got a whole bunch of trees and shrubs on your small little wooded lot, you're never going to see this bird here, the bobolink, that needs that wide open grassland habitat. But if your goal, you have a large property and you just want bobolinks, yeah, absolutely. Mow everything. Let's keep that field going strong for them. But if you're hoping for as many different species as you can possibly have on your property, you're going to want something more like this, many layers. Okay, some text here, not super exciting. How is this laid out typically? Well, it doesn't take too much to imagine, but if I am designing a garden space, I'm figuring out where I need to be walking, where the traffic flow needs to go, and then I'm kind of building up from there. And so you'd have first your lowest, your ground cover layer, and that can include some lawn, of course, because there's no better ground cover for foot traffic than a lawn. But then you're building up some taller herbaceous plants from there, on the edge, hopefully a shrub layer, then maybe some smaller trees, and then if you have room for it, if you have some left over, your canopy trees. The placement, ideally, for your shrubs and your trees is going to be on an edge or closer to those taller trees. So just having one random shrub just stuck out in the middle of nowhere or one random tree will definitely encourage some folks to come in and visit. But if you can have these layers building, if you will, as you'd kind of see in the natural world, where you see that meadow and that transition, or if you're seeing that transition from kind of herbaceous to shrubby to small trees to forests, that's what we find out in the natural world. And then it's good to look for places to increase that vertical structure. So what does that mean? I mean, anywhere for me that I have, a property line, a fence line, any sort of walkway or driveway, a lot of times that's where I'm trying to increase height. So that's where I would put my taller shrub border, put my taller trees. And then I have this too, if you just have a big lawn right now, you can create just an island in the middle too, and that's going to support more than what you had currently. Little island. So ultimately, wildlife, though, are going to use your property based on those layers, but also based on the species composition. So you have to have both. So I have two landscapes up here that are on the screen. The one on the left here is kind of our traditional suburban garden, where we've got a whole mix of different, mostly Asian herbaceous flowering species for our herbaceous. So we got our lawn, and then we've got our astilbe mainly in this picture. So nice Asian species, beautiful. Then we have our shrub layer up to the house and just a few trees scattered here and there. Great, we've got all the layers, but we don't actually have plants there that most species are going to use. Versus this picture over here, which I believe is from the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, native plant garden there, where we have a whole bunch of native plants forming that herbaceous layer, building some height with some vines on that hedgerow there, or that fence, and then a bunch of taller trees and shrubs forming the backdrop. That's going to be a lot, picture on the right, that habitat's a lot more productive than the one on the left. So you've probably had this jammed down your throat a whole lot, but native plants really are the way to go. They do support a lot more wildlife species, especially insects. And really, if we're starting from the base, it's the insects that we care about the most, because they're kind of the base of, outside of the plants are the base of the food web, but insects from there are really what a lot of wildlife are going to be going after in your yard. And they evolve together. So insects, really, majority of insect species are very specialized in what they can eat, plant-eating insects, that is. And so they may only have a small group of plants they can eat. And those plants that came from Asia, insects have not evolved a way to eat those or really compensate for whatever defense mechanisms are in there, chemical compounds, what have you. Hence, they tend to be very beautiful and unblemished in the landscape. So at this point, usually I always like to say, just define what is a native plant, particularly in the gardening sense. And I'll tell you my philosophy on this. So right here, if you're going to the garden center and they have a section that's marked native plants, you're probably going to find both of these species, the purple coneflower and foam flower. However, foam flower, Erler, is a species where you see it green on the map here is where that species is native. So New Hampshire falls well within the realm. This is a plant I find all over the place in the Lakes region, typically in shady areas near a lot of moisture. So near streams, often near rivers, near ponds, seepages coming out of a mountain hillside. If you hike in the White Mountains in late May or so, you're probably going to see a lot of this plant blooming. Really wonderful. That echinacea, that purple coneflower, which is on all sorts of native plant lists out there, obviously does not live in New Hampshire. You do not find these growing wild up here. This is really a plant of the South and the Midwest, really the prairie states. It's a prairie plant. So, what does that mean, right? For me, when I am designing a garden, I try not to get too hung up on whether something is native specifically to New Hampshire. You certainly can, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and a lot of people will, and a lot of people will promote that exclusively, right? Like, if it doesn't grow in New Hampshire, then you shouldn't have it in your native plant garden or your wildlife garden. I don't find that particularly realistic for people that are really interested in gardening. Part of what draws a lot of people to horticulture and plants in general is the rare and unusual. And so that could mean for a lot of native plant gardeners, you're like, oh, well, yeah, all that stuff's in the woods, but there's like this really cool yellow flowered coneflower that maybe only is found in the Ozarks, but I can grow it in New Hampshire, and there's still a lot of insects that are going to use it. So I really draw the line on whether it's try to stay away from a lot of non-native things if you're really focused on wildlife. That said, if you came to my garden, you would see a lot of bizarre and interesting plants that are from around the world, but they are mixed in heavily with a lot of really productive native things. So I'm scratching an itch for me in the area that's closer to the house, but it tends to get wilder and wilder the further we get out to the perimeter. So I'm not worried about that echinacea being an invasive threat in this area. We are never going to have prairies here. Or, well, I couldn't say never, but in my lifetime, I don't expect that the prairie, short or tall grass prairie, is going to take over in New Hampshire. But there's a lot of insects that will use this plant. So if you're concerned about pollinators, butterflies and bees will be all over this thing. And a lot of other critters. Deer love it too. I have found in my garden this last year, Audrey I think did too. That's not typically not a plant that deer like, but they will eat it. So moving on from that, just another note here too, because native plants are getting so much more traction in the horticulture world, there's also been, I think, increased or maybe sustained interest in creating more of these show ponies or cultivated varieties, cultivars out there. So this is genetically, well, not genetically speaking, botanically speaking, this is the same species. This is Echinacea purpurea up here, the purple coneflower. This is what plant breeders have done to this thing over here, that picture on the right. If we're talking about a plant that's going to actually be useful in terms of nectar and pollen, that thing on the right there, that double pink or whatever it's called, it's really not producing much. Very little pollen, if any, very little nectar because there's really no actual productive parts to that flower. That's just all petals, all ray flowers versus what it should look like in the wild on the left. So you don't necessarily have to stay away from all cultivars. If you're going to the garden center, there's going to be a lot of choices and a lot of plants that have been bred. I don't shy away from some of these, particularly when it comes to shrubs, because a lot of wild shrubs are enormous, right? One of my favorite plants is summer sweet, Clethra alnifolia, because pollinators love it so much. But in its straight species form, this is easily a 12-foot plant. And that's difficult for a lot of people to use in their landscapes. You just simply don't have enough room for this sprawling, creeping 12-plus foot monstrosity. But there are some varieties out there. One that I planted in our pollinator garden at Kirkwood called Sugar Time, which is supposed to max out at like 4 by 4. And the butterflies and bees still seem to like it. So I think it's kind of a compromise there, especially in smaller landscapes. Some of these varieties are useful. But just stay away from stuff that looks like that. And I have noticed, this is totally anecdotal, but this is winterberry holly here. The left is just the straight species with those red berries. But at some point, somebody found a mutant with this yellow fruit. I'm trying to remember what the name of this variety is called. It'll come to me. Again, this is anecdotal, it's my own observation, but it always seems to me that the berries get cleaned off of the just straight species winterberry a lot faster than any of these cultivated varieties or hybrids that you can find. I don't know if it's just not quite as recognizable, if there's actually a difference in palatability, but yeah, there's like a winter gold is what this yellow variety is called. I don't know. The birds just don't seem quite as excited about it. But it is, it's pretty. Okay, so another important thing here, besides just whether it's native or not, is that plant diversity. You know, if you go out into the natural world, there's easily going to be 50 plus plant species in any given area. I mean, maybe not if you're restricted to just hemlock forest, not a whole lot in the understory there, but in the broader landscape, there's a lot going on. And so if I am designing an area, I'm really aiming to have 9 or more species. So if it's a very small spot, that might be all you can do, because typically it's nice to plant things in blocks. Don't plant one of each, plant 3 or 5 or more. It's just kind of nice from a design perspective. It also reads a little bit more natural, more flowing if you have a whole sweep of one particular plant versus just one of everything. Now, that comes down to a little bit of, again, design perspective. But oftentimes when you look at a garden, you say, man, that's beautiful. A lot of times there are sweeps of the same plant. And that is typically what you find out in the woods too, or anywhere out in the field. You know, if the conditions are right for a certain plant, you're going to see a whole bunch of that one plant or others mixed in. And then if you are concerned about pollinators, you probably know about host plants. The monarch butterfly is the quintessential example. But if you want to have monarch butterflies, then you really need to have that milkweed. But there's other species too, like spicebush swallowtail. If you want to have spicebush swallowtails, you better have a spicebush on your property. And then, yeah, I mentioned the groups. Okay, so special habitat features to pay attention to. This is probably already in your head. But most of our macrofauna, our birds and our mammals, all those wildlife, are really going to be after the fruits and seeds. I don't mention the woodchucks and the deer because oftentimes those are the guys that we don't want necessarily in our gardens. But a lot of the guys that we do like seeing need that fruit. So a lot of birds will eat the fruit if it's readily available. Becomes especially important during migration. So species that fruit later in the season can be really wonderful, like the juniper here for this yellow rump warbler. Black bear is enjoying some black cherry there. And of course, hummingbird enjoying some cardinal flower. So nectar sources for hummingbirds. And I do think as wonderful as hummingbird feeders are, I do think there's something special about having some plants that hummingbirds actually just want to forage from naturally on your property. Important too to make sure you have some nesting habitat. The bird boxes are great, but there's a limited number of species that will use those. You know, over at the Science Center, we'll get house wrens typically, tree sparrows because we have a lot of open fields, or tree swallows, I should say. Tree swallows in open fields and bluebirds. But lots of other guys like these barred owls here really need that nice tree cavity. So this is a bit of a plug here to leave some of those ugly trees on your property, which is, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir to this group, but if I was giving this talk in Nashua, there might be more pushback. And then mammals use these a lot too, of course, right? So whether you like the squirrel on your property or not, you know, squirrels, raccoons, others are going to be using these for habitat. Nest houses for bats. This is not the house. This is an image stolen from the internet, actually, of that bat house. But they work if you site them properly. If you have them in a nice southeast facing direction, you have them high enough from the ground. And bee houses, lots of buzz, if you'll excuse the pun, around bee houses. These work great for a select number of species that are cavity nesters. Things like mason bees, you may have heard of. Will find a spot in the wild. It would be something like a hollow reed or hollow stem that they would lay their eggs in and make in these little cavities. They do use them, and these are both houses that are in Kirkwood Gardens. The one that's more effective, actually, is the homemade job, and that's the one that's on the left. So you can find online a lot of these, you know, fancy little built contraptions, I guess, like we have here on the left, very pretty. I think it came from Crown Bees or Better Bee, one of those. Or they said, whatever, the one on the right. The one on the left was one that one of the gardeners just made, and that's just an untreated, I think, 6x6 with various size holes drilled in it. And that's the one that consistently gets used by mason bees every year. And you probably can't see it from where you're sitting, but a lot of those holes are plugged up with little bits of mud and debris. I don't have the specifications here, but there are very specific size holes and depth of holes that you want to drill in order to get bees to use this. But it's a cool thing to have. And yeah, we don't necessarily have a lot of that habitat right in the garden with these hollow sticks sticking around, so cool thing. Already talked about this too, but yeah, leaving all of those dead trees and limbs for foraging that you can. So anything that's not a hazard to the house or any other property, I would leave, which again is a stretch for a lot of people. My own relatives, when they visited my parents' house, who live in the suburbs of Minneapolis, were very upset about all of the dead trees that were on the perimeter of the property. Like, oh, Dave, you've got a chainsaw, why don't you get out there and cut those down? But they are important habitat, particularly for foraging, for these guys here. Brush piles and rock walls. Rock walls are the easier sell for a garden. Yep. A lot of, yeah, small mammals, reptiles, snakes. Garter snakes love these. Are great shelter, maybe even denning sites or nesting sites if you're a snake. But brush piles are awesome. And I think anybody who has trees or shrubs is probably going to have one of those anyways. So don't feel bad if you didn't get around to burning it, because this is actually pretty good habitat for a lot of small mammals. Not so much like the New England cottontail we don't have up here, but if we did, they would love this. A lot of birds, especially a lot of the smaller birds that hang out near the ground like these. So don't feel bad. Leave that brush pile. It's for the wildlife, you can tell people. Water features. We're blessed in New Hampshire with lots and lots of water, but it's incredible, even just the smallest little pond feature, or even just a bird bath. Who else comes in? Something else that I did not put on here that can be helpful is creating just a puddle or wet little spot. A lot of butterflies need to be able to find a spot, like just a moistened spot with bare ground or mud. And they'll be using that a little bit for water, but also to get the mineral nutrients that they need to pull up. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, if you live right next to the lake, should you still have a smaller water feature like that bird bath? Is it useful? I don't think there's any harm in it, particularly if you can keep up on it with the mosquitoes and whatnot, if that feels like a reasonable thing. A lot of birds, particularly that will use a bird bath, don't want the deeper water. They want just that shallow little bit of water that something like a bird bath provides. There is actually, where I live, a decent-sized pond that's really close. But we also have a little goldfish pond with a little just running fountain through it. And the chipmunks are always drinking out of that. The red squirrels are. The cardinals and occasionally blue jays will take a bath in that smaller feature there. So there's a whole pond down there, but it's too deep for them to be able to use, really, for that purpose. But the lake is wonderful because there's a lot of other species like the bats. You would not have bats with a bird bath, but they love that lake. So it's really what you're up for. The mosquitoes would be my only concern if you didn't think you could keep up with refreshing that water often enough to keep the mosquito larvae out of there. Okay, with the time I have left, I'm going to talk a little bit about taking stock of what's in your existing landscape, how we're going to manage invasive species that we have on our properties, and just, kind of how to make some of these plant choices. This is really quick here, and you probably already know this, but just inventory what you already have on your property for plants and animals. Learn about your soil if you can. This doesn't have to be super detailed. I mean, a soil test is wonderful, but just knowing if it's sandy, if it drains really fast, or if it is a bit more heavier, if that water tends to stay around for a while, if it's a little swampier. Great to know. Sown exposure, of course, and then confirm your planting zone. Hasn't changed a lot here. But it has shifted. So in 2023, we got a new USDA map. We were working from the 2012 map before that. And it's changed quite a bit. So if you're in the Lakes region here, you're either in 5A or 5B. And what that means is that the average extreme minimum winter temperature is between minus 10 and minus 15. So it's not sustained, but I'm very confident planting really anything that's a zone 5 hardy plant in this area. If you have any concerns, just stick with 3s and 4s, but I have not had any issue with things zone 5 staying alive. Some zone 6 stuff is starting to do okay up here. Okay, so our invasives here. Who here has invasives on their property? Yeah, unfortunately, this area is chock-a-block full. And we humans are responsible for a lot of that, and unfortunately, a lot of the plants that are a big pain for us now were introduced as ornamentals. So landscape or horticulture trade, which I am in, is responsible for this. I threw some species up here that are the biggest headache for me at the Science Center. That Oriental bittersweet everywhere. Japanese knotweed, we have a couple of smaller patches that I expect to be fighting for the next 10 years. That purple loosestrife in our wet areas, multiflora rose in the fields, and glossy buckthorn, which is one that has really just come into the Lakes region, I'd say, in the last decade or so, but it is moving fast. This has black, shiny little fruits that the birds love. It also, unfortunately, fortunately for the plant, but it gives birds diarrhea. So it goes in and it comes out fast. So they spread it like crazy. And it's, yeah, that's a nice one there. But this is showing up now at the Science Center, so I expect it's other areas around Holderness, and it's certainly in New Hampton where I'm living.
One that has long ropes for stems.
Long ropes. Does have long ropes for stems. It's pretty straight. It's not a vine. It's a shrub that can grow into a small tree if you leave it alone. But more often than not, you're seeing it as this multi-stem, 10 to 12 foot, straight-looking thing. A lot of times in rights of way. Not bittersweet. I'm trying to think of the vine you might be thinking of. We can talk more. And then Norway maple, which is one that was planted, unfortunately, on the Science Center grounds years ago, and it just keeps spreading, and I'll be fighting it for probably the whole time I'm there. Are there any benefits to invasive species? There are some studies that have looked into this. Certainly overall, no. Certain bird species that are frugivorous, like catbirds, their populations tend to go up in areas where there's a lot of invasives. And I have found other species like snowshoe hare and woodcocks and grouse tend to do well in some of these shrubby sort of habitats, a lot of times in rights of way where the invasives have come in. But by and large, no. We don't, on our own properties, don't need to be keeping these guys around. I try to lay out just some guidelines if you're thinking about managing invasives on your property. I mean, the first is just figure out what you have, right? Identify it. And then figure out what your goal is. I think a lot of times we throw a ton of effort and energy at these plants without really any idea of what the long-term plan is going to be, or even what is potentially feasible with the amount of energy or resources that we have. So think like, is the goal remove all of them? Is it focus on a specific area, or just target a specific species? At the Science Center with the invasives work that I'm focusing on, I am starting with areas that are islands, if you will, where it feels more manageable. There's certain spots that are just, we've got 3 acres of bittersweet. And it feels like a little bit too much for my own time and the resources I have with volunteers to take that on. But the area that's in the middle of our trail, where we have a little bit of a buffer with, it could be roads, it could be your neighbor's mowed property, it could be just some more definable area that feels a little bit more manageable. And then the right techniques for the job, I'll touch on those very quickly, but you're committing to a multi-year effort, unfortunately. Chemical control, this is kind of fraught. This is a viable option for any of you that own your property. This is something that is totally, it's wild out there, but you can apply whatever pesticide, herbicide you can get your hands on as long as it's on your own property. My recommendation with this, because there are, I think, sometimes some of these plants it can be an exercise in futility if all you were doing is mechanical control, cutting, pulling over and over and over again. I think there is an argument for some of the broadleaf, concentrated herbicides that can be applied very selectively, and something that I would recommend if you're going this way is doing more of a painting technique, like a cut stump treatment, not broadcast sprays, but very targeted applications where you're just getting that living tissue on the trunk. But make your own decisions on this, but just know, not okay for you to go to the park or wherever else you're volunteering and do this, but if it is on your own property, read that pesticide label, use all the PPE that you need, and know that in some cases this is warranted. Mechanical control, you've probably all done this, but one tool to highlight there is the uprooter, the polar bear, the weed wrench was a brand that's not made anymore. Really wonderful tool for getting rid of woody plants. It's basically just this wrench tool for getting the roots right out of the ground. I use this all the time. Okay, an important thing to note here too is if you are tackling invasives, have a plan for what you're going to do to cover that soil as soon as possible. Pretty much all of the invasives that I've mentioned are really, really wonderful colonizers. So you leave them some bare soil, they're going to be back right away. There are probably tons and tons of seeds already in that seed bank in that soil. So once an area is cleared, like this area was at the center there, ideally you're ready to come in right away with native plants and hopefully a thick mulch layer. So what I use, because it's cheap and readily available, is arborist wood chips. Sometimes you can get them for free from a local arborist if you call them up and they need a spot to dump them. Or if you have any tree work done on your property, I encourage you to please ask them to just leave those chips there because they're a really wonderful mulch. Okay, so this is a project that we actually had going at the Science Center. If you've visited, you've maybe seen this pollinator garden. We had this little corner, and again, this little one of these little pockets that I look at tackling because it just feels more manageable. So between our deer exhibit, our staff residence, and our barn, the old red barn, this was totally taken over this area with Norway maple, bittersweet, burning bush, barberry. What am I missing? It was just this nasty snarl, and it was right on the exhibit trail. And so a whole bunch of garden volunteers got in here and started grubbing. So this is September of 2022, November of 2022, what we'd gotten it down to by the time we were going into winter. So we're almost at a blank slate here, still some stumps to pull. This is July of 2023, the following year. So we rented a little excavator for the day and pulled up that big ash stump that was in the middle, pulled up a few more stumps that were from Norway maples, got some bittersweet root out of there. And then, yeah, we tilled up the soil, created these paths through here, and then got to planting in August of 23. So all of these plants were sourced from Van Berkom Nursery, who was a wholesaler in Deerfield, New Hampshire. So all planted there. After our big planting effort, which remarkably only took about an hour, because I had 18 people show up to help out. And then this was it in July of this past year of 25. So yeah, pretty remarkable change, right? We benefited from some decent soil being there. I'm told that may have historically been a pig pen in that area. Not everybody has that, right? Doesn't have old farmland right next door. Because we did so much work prepping this site in advance, the invasives haven't been terrible. We do get bittersweet coming up here and there, but it is fairly manageable. But there is just constant checks throughout the season. But yeah, it's possible. You can do this. With 18 people, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think the message really, it's just so often I think people get discouraged because they're trying to tackle too big of an area or too big of a project. This is a very small area, so we were able to see some real results in a relatively short amount of time. Okay, so in terms of selecting plants, and these are my last couple slides here, I mentioned this already, but really pay attention to that sun exposure, the soil type, and what you already have there. If you match the plants you put in your landscape to the site conditions that you already have, it's going to be the easiest possible thing you can do. You're really not going to have to irrigate much. You're not going to have to worry too much about any sort of pest issue because you've got happy plants. So for large trees here, I've already kind of plugged oak. If you have oak, keep your oak. You can always plant oak too. The white oaks are the most productive for wildlife, the most insects like this, and the acorns also are preferred. It's also the slowest growing. So white oak takes a very long time to do anything, but any of them are good. Sugar maple and red maple, also great. Not quite, as from an insect perspective, not quite as useful as the oaks, but still a wonderful plant. Black gum for those that are looking for something a little bit more unusual or interesting in their yard. This is a plant that we have growing right in this area, and you'll see it growing sporadically around Squam if you're out. Typically, you'll only find it growing in areas with very wet soils. It's said to like wet feet or swampy conditions, and yet it is very adaptable. So you can put it in a dry soil, and it's like, oh, okay. So this is often cited as being a pretty good street tree as a native because it is adapted to having that waterlogged condition growing in wetter areas. It doesn't mind if its root system gets compacted by a lot of foot traffic. And wonderful fall color. And nice fruit, too, that a lot of critters eat. And then white pine. Nobody's planting that. For small trees, a nice one we have around here is the American hop hornbeam, named for those flowers and fruits that look kind of like hops. It's also called ironwood. You typically find this growing in wetter drainage sort of areas as an understory tree. But really neat, and I don't have a picture of the bark or the trunk here, but it just grows in a really interesting pattern. Serviceberry, which I'm pleased to say I've been able to find at pretty much any local nursery that I've checked out. There's a bunch of different species. All of them will get used for those flowers and for the fruits they form later on, so a nice small tree. Redbud, I already plugged this guy. It's a great one. That pagoda dogwood, which I plugged too. Crabapples, great. Eastern red cedar, great. Hawthorns, American hornbeams, all of those are good. Crabapples not native, but a lot of critters like them. For shrubs, winterberry's awesome. Spice bush I mentioned is awesome. This grows wild all over the place in southern New Hampshire, but its range doesn't quite extend this far north, but it grows just fine in gardens up here. American hazelnut, this is one that the State Forest Nursery grows, so if you get on that early, get your orders in December or January each year, you can get whole bundles of this. It has nice fruit, which people can eat, critters can eat too. They were out? Yep. Oh, hazelnut was out. Yeah, the State Forest Nursery, if you've never heard of it, the State of New Hampshire has a nursery in Boscawen where they grow seedling trees and shrubs, from seed. And so you can order these plants for, geez, like, I don't know, probably, huh?
Pines are $1.50.
Pines are $1.50. They're very cheap. It's very popular, so you have to kind of be on it from early December, the second their catalog gets out. Usually they're sold out by January. The State Forest Nursery, New Hampshire State Forest Nursery. But, yeah, ton of trees, a lot of shrubs. They sell a wildlife package, which has got some dogwoods and hazelnut and stuff in it. Really, it's a cheap way to buy these plants. You got to be patient because you're getting stuff that's about a foot tall. But quite honestly, a lot of times those small plants end up growing a lot faster than the potted things because their root systems are less damaged. And the last one, the summer sweet, I already mentioned, the clethra. You can find this growing near wet areas in New Hampshire too, and it's a butterfly magnet. For perennials, if you have any wet spot that has some sun, cardinal flower I think is a must. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite wildflowers, and it's a late season bloomer. Really, really good plant to see hummingbirds on with those red tubular flowers. Mountain mint is a plant. It is a true mint, related to probably most closely to the bee balms you might have in the garden. It's not the showiest thing, but it is one of the most productive pollinator plants that I have seen in really any landscape, and there's a whole bunch of different species. I've started 2 from seed really easily. This one, the clustered mountain mint and slender mountain mint, and I'm starting a 3rd species this winter to be planting around the Science Center. But this gets covered with bees and all sorts of different really interesting wasps and flies. It's a cool plant, and you can use it for tea. Any of the goldenrods, again, you may not need to plant these on your property, but keep some around because these are really, really important nectar sources late in the season, and pollen. Joe Pye weed. This is another one if you have just an average garden soil or even a wetter spot. In Kirkwood gardens, every fall, typically in September, this gets absolutely loaded with monarch butterflies. And the bees use it too, but it's really wonderful and makes the top list for a lot of wildflowers. And then wild bee balm. This one's nice because it blooms earlier. This is a bloom you're going to see in June. Powdery mildew prone. So I'd put it more in the back of the border if you don't really want a skunky looking thing right up in your face. Yeah, it gets a lot of use. Okay, I guess I have a couple more. I'm going over. Pennsylvania sedge. If you've got a shady, dry spot, or you're looking for a lawn alternative, this one on the left here, Pennsylvania sedge, is awesome. It's a clumper, so you have to plant a whole bunch of it if you want to sweep, but these clumps just keep getting bigger and bigger. You find this growing wild in the woods, typically in hardwood stands in New Hampshire, but I've used it a couple spots in Kirkwood recently. Creeping phlox is another really nice one. Not something you find in New Hampshire woods, but probably if you went to New Jersey, you'd start to see this. Early spring bloomer. Wild ginger. I haven't seen this up here, but I've seen it in the Berkshires. And if you go over into Vermont, you can find it too. The soils are a little bit nicer, but it will grow in our soils here. That foam flower I mentioned, this forms a really wonderful ground cover in shady areas. And it's kind of similar to heuchera, if you know that. And then green and gold chrysogonum. This is a nice one too. That's a really good ground cover that attracts a lot of critters. Tends to like a part sun spot and just kind of average soil. Okay, and then I think I've just got grasses here. So don't ignore grasses. Grasses are important habitat too. A lot of native bees like to nest at the bases of grasses, particularly where there's some bare soil. Prairie dropseed's a really nice one that gets to be about a foot tall. Nice kind of weeping habit. Little blue stem is one that you find in very marginal soils and fields around here. It's often a mark for me of kind of a poor soil area in a field because it likes that dry, sandy, cruddy soil. But it's really beautiful, and there's a lot of different varieties out there that have various degrees of red and blue. Switchgrass is another one. This is something you could find growing in the wild in New Hampshire, but again, there's all these varieties out there that the color is more accented on. And then northern sea oats is just, those seed heads speak for themselves. You know, just really, really, really pretty plant. And then I threw up some annuals here. I'll pull them all up at once. These are not native, but if you do want to attract a whole bunch of different insects to your garden, these are things that all of these plants get incorporated into Kirkwood gardens every year because they are so good. And the best of all of them is the Mexican sunflower there on the right. You either get it in yellow or orange. Everybody likes this plant. Unfortunately, it doesn't do real well in pots, so you don't find, I've never seen it for sale at a garden center before, but lucky for us, it's no harder to start than a marigold. So if you can do marigolds in a windowsill, you can probably start this plant. It doesn't like to sit in a pot for a long time, so kind of do the shortest window possible before transplant. I've put plants in that are about this big in end of May, and by September, we've got a 5-6 foot monster. So definitely grow that one if you can. You can't read this up here, but you'll be able to see this after. UNH Extension has a whole bunch of really wonderful plant lists. So if you are to just Google UNH wildlife plants, UNH native plants for gardening, you're going to pull up a whole bunch of plant lists for recommendations, which I would absolutely recommend you go and check out. And with that, that's me. That's my time. Thank you for the couple extra minutes. Okay, so the question was, is there a good nursery around with native plants? There actually are. There's a exclusive native plant nursery that I think it's in, it's right outside Concord, called Bagley Pond Perennials. Bagley Pond Perennials. Might be in Warner. It's in Warner? Warner? Yeah. I get everything mixed up in Merrimack County. But they exclusively grow and sell natives, which is great. Cackleberries, just over there in Meredith. Lori always has quite a few natives because she gets a lot of her stock from Van Berkom Nursery in Deerfield. They're all mixed in, but hopefully they're labeled. Who else? It's tough. A lot of the nurseries and some of my favorites have closed down. But Black Forest Nursery in Boscawen, too, I noticed when I visited there last year, had a nice section that was kind of set up that was more of just native stuff. They make it hard. A lot of it's just mixed in, and they move stuff around. Is Kirkwood going to have the plant sale again? Probably not. I can't say never. It was a much beloved event, but it was an incredible amount of work and not. It was a pretty terrible fundraiser for the garden. It was a wonderful friend raiser. We had lots of friends in the community that loved it, but it was about 3 months of work for just a couple $1,000s. So my efforts have, I now have a whole lot more time to work on other projects with some of these habitat restoration things, not doing that. But we also have some concerns too about invasives. We did find invasive jumping worms in Kirkwood, and it's not a nice thing to share plants from your garden once you know you have those, if somebody doesn't have them. So, and we don't have a good way of isolating. That would be even more labor to try to keep stuff clean. So, probably not. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I loved the Kirkwood Gardens Day sale too. I grew up being voluntold at that more often than not. My mom actually managed Kirkwood for its first 27 years, and I've taken over. Yeah. So, is it nepotism? No, it's not. Yeah. Yeah, in the back there. Oh, any lilies? Are there any lilies native? Lilies, right? Yeah, there's a couple. The Canada lily is the one name for it, or Turk's cap, that orange lily you can see. But not the roadside orange one that everybody thinks of. That one, it's the name for it is a fulva daylily. A lot of people call them tiger lilies. Those are from Asia and spread everywhere. I don't know of a whole lot of stuff using those, really, although you can eat them. The buds and the new shoots, or you can throw in a stir fry in there. More of a novelty than anything. They're not great. I've tried it, but yeah, the Turk's cap or Canada lilies are kind of the native ones that you'd really think of. And unfortunately, the Asiatic lily beetles hit those too. So those red beetles that hit a lot of the garden lilies that people have. You can find those for sale sometimes. I think even Van Berkom sells them on a limited basis, but there's not much, and none of the daylilies. I love daylilies. This is where I, once again, am like, oh, it's not native, but I love it. Like, there's a lot of times landscape situations that lend themselves really well to non-native things, unfortunately. Parking lot islands are not a great home for really many of our native plants, period. But it's nice to still have those plants, those places landscaped. So daylily, wonderful spot right there next to the driveway in the parking lot island. They're so tough. They don't need to be watered ever. So and you gotta love that. Yes, absolutely. So Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Mass. It used to be the New England Wildflower Society. They changed their name to the Native Plant Trust. But this is their display garden in Framingham, and it's a really cool spot because it's right in a little suburban neighborhood, but you go into this garden and you have all these beautiful mature trees, kind of every single ornamental native plant that you could conceivably find somewhere in New England. I think sometimes it's a little bit of a stretch, right? You're like, oh, we found one of these in Connecticut, so we can have it in our garden. It counts. But really, really wonderful spot. And because so many of our native wildflowers are ephemerals, so they're happiest in the spring, it's a good spot to go down and visit in May, because that's when it's probably at its peak, although it's beautiful any time of the year. And like she said, they sell plants there too. The Native Plant Trust has a production nursery called Nasami Farm, and they have plants for retail sale there. So it's kind of a twofer. Go look at beautiful plants and pick up some plants. Okay, so tall verbena is that purple one with the monarch butterfly on it, Verbena bonariensis. This is one that if you can get it established in your garden, it tends to self-sow. So I don't really ever plant this in Kirkwood. It tends to just come up on its own. So that's a good one, and the butterflies really, really like it. Cosmos are just, your grandma, I'm sure, probably grew cosmos, just an old-fashioned annual, but the bees really like it. Cigar plant is probably really the only unusual thing up here, and that's not one you're going to be able to find from seed. You're going to have to pick this up at the garden center. I think it just doesn't propagate all that well from seed. I think usually these are actually grown from vegetative cuttings. But it's a cool plant, I think from South America, that hummingbirds really, really like. So I like to have a few of these around specifically just for the ruby-throated hummingbirds with those really long, skinny, cigar-shaped flowers. It's a cool one. And then really any zinnia that's a little bit more of a natural flower form. And some of the like triple, quadruple, whatever zinnias are, I don't know. I don't see a ton of activity on them, but any of these that have that nice central cone are good. And there's others too. But I think these, from at least what I have noticed myself, are the most productive.
Are phlox considered pollinators? Phlox.
Oh, phlox pollinator plants, yeah. Tall garden phlox is a really wonderful plant if you can get a variety that doesn't have powdery mildew issues. Yeah, phlox is great. And that is not native to New Hampshire, but there is a phlox paniculata growing somewhere out there in the wild on the eastern seaboard. It is a native plant. Most of what we get at the garden center you would never see in the wild, but just kind of a demure pink small flower plant you could find. Butterflies, moths seem to like that the best. The powdery mildew is really the biggest complication for gardens, but there are some varieties out there that are decent that don't. What's that? Yeah. So I did not mention asters. Asters, perennials, tons and tons of wild ones we have around here. They're awesome. Yeah. And in our pollinator garden, I actually planted several species, a couple of which are a little bit thuggy in the garden setting if you don't deadhead them. The New England aster and heart-leafed aster seed I found after the first year so seeded in like crazy, and they became kind of the primary weeding target. But that's actually a problem I don't mind having. I think the longer you garden, the more easy it is to be heartless and pull up plants that might be a desirable plant and throw them on the compost pile. But I like that. I call it editing usually, of plant like that aster's fine. I just like you over there, not right up here in the front. But yeah, they're excellent. Plant asters, keep asters.